300 burned-out truck hulls are now scattered across the R-280 highway, Russia's primary land supply corridor into Crimea. 300 in the first half of June alone, on top of the dozens destroyed in May. 6 months of relentless campaign documented in satellite imagery that shows a road that was supposed to be Russia's lifeline to its most prized territorial acquisition, turning into an open-air graveyard of destroyed vehicles. This is not the result of a single successful operation. It is the visible surface of a deliberate, funded, systematically executed campaign to make Crimea logistically indefensible. And the people running it have made clear they are not finished. On May 27th, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense formally announced the Logistics Lockdown Program. Approximately $113 million channeled directly into units conducting medium-range strikes against Russian logistics across occupied Ukraine. In the Kremlin-installed administration of the peninsula, the announcement landed as confirmation of what they had already been watching develop for months. Logistics lockdown was not a new problem. It was the formalization and expansion of a campaign that was already producing serious, measurable damage. The stated objective is simple to describe and operationally significant to execute. Wherever Russia routes its supply vehicles, Ukraine will strike. The program is funded to sustain that campaign through the summer and beyond. To understand why Crimea is the center of this campaign, you have to understand what it represents within Russia's war architecture. Not symbolically, but functionally. Crimea is not simply a peninsula Russia annexed in 2014. It is the logistics node through which a significant portion of Russia's southern front receives its supply, its reinforcements, and its strike capability. Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs documented Russia's pre-invasion military buildup on the peninsula: 12 multiple-launch rocket systems, 40 tanks, 62 helicopters, 122 combat aircraft, 162 heavy artillery units, and 583 armored vehicles. That accumulation happened over years before February 2022 and positioned Crimea as the foundation from which Russian forces seized large portions of southern Ukraine within the first days of the invasion. The peninsula hosts military airfields, ammunition storage facilities, missile and drone launch sites, and the Black Sea Fleet infrastructure. Or rather, what remains of it after Ukraine's sustained maritime drone campaign destroyed approximately a third of the fleet and forced the remainder to abandon Sevastopol for Novorossiya, substantially further from the operational area. From Crimea, Russia has been supplying and launching operations into Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts throughout the war. Disrupting that capability directly affects Russian offensive capacity in both regions simultaneously. Isolating Crimea is not a peripheral objective. It is an attack on the cornerstone of Russia's entire southern front architecture. Subscribe now if this level of sourced, detailed analysis on the Crimea campaign is what you want from this channel. The operational picture is moving faster than most reporting captures, and there is considerably more to cover. The instrument making isolation possible is a new generation of medium-range strike drones capable of engaging targets at operational depth, typically 20 to 200 kilometers behind the contact line. This is where Russian logistics infrastructure lives alongside command posts, troop concentrations, supply stations, and dispersed air defense systems. Ukraine's approach has been deliberately calibrated to avoid the densest concentrations of Russian air defense on the front line itself, where intercept rates are highest. Instead, strike assets route around those concentrations to reach the logistical arteries behind them: convoys, fuel trucks, bridge crossings, and railway infrastructure that cannot be moved behind air defense coverage without losing their logistical function. The statistical trend in medium-range strikes is unambiguous. Ukraine quadrupled its medium-range strike volume between February and March 2026. It doubled again between March and April. May's numbers exceeded April's by 50%. June is tracking to set an entirely new record. This is not a stable rate of attrition. It is an accelerating campaign that is intensifying as Ukraine's production capacity for medium-range platforms comes online and the program funding flows into operational units. The primary targets are fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and military convoys moving along the roads that connect the Russian mainland through occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson into Crimea. The goal is not to destroy every vehicle, it is to make every route sufficiently dangerous that Russian logistics planners cannot move the volumes required to sustain frontline operations. The R-280 highway, which Russian forces themselves refer to as the Novorossiya route, linking Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol, Berdyansk and Melitopol toward the peninsula, was the first and most direct target. According to reporting from The Guardian cited by the Kyiv Post on June 11th, military traffic along the R-280 has declined by approximately 71% under sustained drone pressure on convoys, bridges, and rail infrastructure along the corridor. The 412th Nemesis Brigade has been among the leading units in this campaign, destroying dozens of trucks and tankers along the highway since May. American-supplied Hornet drones, approximately the size of a surfboard with a range of roughly 150 kilometers, have been conducting near-continuous patrol and strike missions over the corridor, maintaining persistent pressure that forces Russian logistics operators to make every convoy decision knowing that drone coverage over this route is not intermittent. With the R-280 increasingly dangerous to use at required volumes, Russia attempted to route supply traffic through alternative crossings in the Kherson region. Ukraine had anticipated this shift and was ready. The Chonhar Bridge, the primary crossing between occupied mainland Ukraine and Crimea, was struck multiple times in early June. Ukrainian forces from the 475th Separate Assault Regiment and the 1st Separate Assault Regiment, using Behemoth and FP-2 drones, punched holes through the bridge deck. Vladimir Saldo, the Kremlin-installed head of occupied Kherson Oblast, was forced to publicly confirm the damage and the suspension of traffic. Ukraine struck the same crossing again 2 days later, producing additional damage that Saldo acknowledged on Telegram. Satellite imagery analyzed by Radio Liberty's investigative project showed dark scorch marks through the bridge's central span, with a hastily positioned pontoon section alongside it as emergency compensation. The pontoon was identified in earlier satellite imagery from June 2023. Russia had been anticipating this scenario for 2 years and had pre-positioned the backup. The backup was also struck. By June 11th, Da Vinci's 1st Separate Assault Regiment confirmed that a coordinated operation had destroyed approximately 50 Russian military vehicles on the Armyansk bridge, vehicles loaded with fuel and ammunition, rendering that crossing functionally unusable. The same night, Ukrainian forces struck 4 separate bridge crossings connecting occupied Kherson to Crimea simultaneously. Structures over the North Crimean Canal near Preobrazhenka and Mirn, a road bridge on the Perekop-Armyansk route, and a crossing near Stavki. Saldo confirmed he had dispatched specialists to assess whether the structures could even be repaired. On June 13th, Da Vinci's unit struck the Chonhar road bridge again, alongside a railway bridge, a pontoon crossing installed to replace it, and military vehicles queuing on the approach. As the unit noted in its public statement, the pontoon crossings simply do not have the throughput capacity Russia needs to sustain supply volumes, which forces vehicles to queue in the open, converting the backup solution into a target. Between June 7th and June 13th, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces working alongside the 475th, the 1st Assault Regiment, and Da Vinci's unit conducted more than 100 strikes and sorties against bottlenecks in northern Crimea's approach corridors. Newly deployed Behemoth drones operated alongside the established Lyut and FP-1 platforms. Reports have referenced a system called the Morrigan, a lightweight fixed-wing platform capable of launching without a runway using a sling or rail mechanism, reportedly used to suppress air defense systems and clear approach corridors for follow-on strikes. On June 13th, pilots from Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces struck the Crimean Titan chemical plant in Armyansk, identified as the largest titanium dioxide industrial complex in Eastern Europe, producing materials used in protective and stealth coatings applied to Russian military equipment. This was not a logistics target. It was a defense industrial target on the peninsula itself. Ukraine struck it anyway. By June 14th, the 1st Separate Assault Regiment had expanded operations northward, striking the Jazankoy checkpoint, a railway bridge, and a pontoon crossing in the Chonhar direction, while announcing the beginning of systematic operations specifically designed to prevent Russia from restoring any of the disrupted supply lines. The naval dimension of the campaign has developed in parallel. Ukraine's maritime drone capability has evolved substantially from the early crewed platforms that first began striking Black Sea Fleet vessels. Current systems include direct strike variants carrying several hundred kilograms of explosives and sea-launched platforms capable of deploying aerial drones that can engage both surface vessels and airborne targets. Ukraine has extended drone operations into the Sea of Azov, which connects directly to Crimea's eastern coastline. On June 5th, the BBC reported confirmed Ukrainian strikes against 5 vessels in the Sea of Azov and coastal waters around occupied territories. Vessels Ukraine identified as involved in grain theft and military cargo transfer. The logistics lockdown program extends to the sea routes as deliberately as to the land corridors. The cumulative effect on Crimea is now visible in ways that Russian occupation officials cannot conceal from the population living under them. The fuel crisis is the most operationally visible consequence. On June 6th, Sevastopol's Kremlin-installed Mayor Mikhail Razvozhayev introduced a requirement that residents use a pre-purchased QR code, accessible only through the Kremlin-controlled Max messaging application, to purchase gasoline. Within days, the ration was tightened from 20 liters per day to 20 liters per week. By mid-June, Razvozhayev publicly admitted that his administration could not issue a new batch of QR codes because fuel delivery trucks were unable to reach Sevastopol at all. A resident of the city described the attempt to purchase fuel to NBC News as feeling like winning a lottery. Signs reading "No" have been taped over pump nozzles at gas stations in towns including Yevpatoria. Even Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who initially attributed the shortage to what he called panic buying, was forced to acknowledge what he described as certain problems when directly asked whether Ukrainian strikes were cutting Crimea off from fuel supplies. A parallel food shortage is developing alongside the fuel crisis. RBC Ukraine reports that empty shelves are becoming routine across the peninsula, with basics including cereal, sugar, flour, and pasta running critically low as Ukraine's logistics strikes and Russia's own heavy military footprint compress civilian supply chains simultaneously. The military consequences are becoming measurable. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed on June 8 that Ukrainian forces had recaptured nearly 100 square kilometers more territory than they had lost in May, bringing total gains since the start of 2026 to over 600 square kilometers. United 24 Media has attributed a portion of this to the reduced supply pressure on Ukrainian defensive positions in Kherson and Zaporizhia, as Crimea's capacity to support offensive operations in those regions diminishes. The Institute for the Study of War, whose assessments reflect independent military analysis rather than either side's official positions, has noted that Ukrainian medium-range strikes are achieving measurable operational effects, specifically degrading Russia's ability to use key logistics corridors connecting the mainland to Crimea and around Donetsk city. When independent analysts use operational rather than symbolic language to describe the results of a campaign, that is significant. Russia's own official responses have provided the most telling confirmation of how seriously the situation is being assessed internally. Vladimir Saldo, the Kremlin-installed administrator of occupied Kherson Oblast, introduced restrictions on civilian truck movement along the R-280 corridor on May 21st. In describing Ukraine's logistics campaign, he invoked the wartime blockade of Leningrad, one of the most devastating sieges in Russian historical memory, calling it an act of cynical barbarism. That is a remarkable comparison for an occupation official to reach for. Invoking Leningrad is not spin, it is panic finding its way into an official public statement. When the administrator of an occupied region begins reaching for the vocabulary of historical catastrophe to describe a logistics disruption, the internal assessment of the situation is available in that word choice. Crimea is also losing its remaining symbolic value as a trophy the Kremlin can display to its domestic audience. On June 10th, a Ukrainian drone strike ignited a fire in the building housing Sevastopol's Defense of Sevastopol 1854-1855 panorama, a massive 19th-century painting depicting the city's defense during the Crimean War, one of the most recognizable pieces of Russian national heritage associated with the peninsula. The painting was effectively destroyed. Military blogger Valery Shiryaev noted that it would be difficult to identify another cultural loss that would wound Putin's sense of the peninsula's historical significance as directly. Putin acknowledged in March that Russia has spent approximately $15.5 billion on Crimea since the 2014 annexation. That investment is being systematically devalued. The money required to sustain Crimea's military and civilian function as supply lines are cut and infrastructure is struck is money Russia must spend at the same moment that war expenditure is projected to exceed the entire 2026 federal budget by $28 billion and European Union sanctions. The 21st package announced by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on June 9th are tightening the financial constraints on Russia's ability to fund the war through energy revenue. The economic noose, the logistics blockade, the military degradation, and the symbolic losses are all tightening simultaneously. This is not happening in isolation from the wider war. On June 8th and 9th, Ukraine's General Staff reported strikes on an ammunition depot near Prokhorovka in Belgorod Oblast, command posts across Donetsk, Belgorod and Kursk regions, and drone control centers across Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Russia cannot solve its Crimea problem by diverting resources from elsewhere because elsewhere is also under sustained pressure. Ukraine's naval drone campaign has already transformed the Black Sea operational environment, destroying approximately a third of the Black Sea fleet and forcing the remainder from Sevastopol to Novorossiya. The ground corridor through occupied southern Ukraine is under medium-range drone interdiction. The bridge crossings into Crimea are being systematically struck and prevented from restoration. The sea routes into the peninsula are under maritime drone surveillance and strike pressure. The defense industrial facilities on the peninsula are now targets. The isolation strategy is not a single line of effort. It is a simultaneous multi-domain campaign that removes each supply option as Russia attempts to shift to it. Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk stated it directly in a June 14th interview. Crimea is surrounded by water on three sides. The history of previous wars fought on this territory suggests that occupations have consistently ended the same way, with retreat. Ukraine is not betting on a ground offensive across the Perekop Isthmus to physically reclaim the peninsula. A ground assault at Perekop against a prepared defense carries costs that current Ukrainian military capacity is not positioned to accept. The isolation strategy achieves something equivalent through different means, making Crimea so logistically degraded, so militarily costly to supply and defend, and so economically burdensome that the calculus of holding it shifts independently of any negotiated settlement. If Putin negotiates, Ukraine holds Crimea's logistical collapse as real leverage. If Putin refuses to negotiate, the collapse continues and the peninsula becomes progressively less defensible. Neither option restores the strategic position Russia held when Crimea was functioning as its primary southern front logistics hub. The roads are burning, the fuel is running out, the food shelves are emptying. The bridges are down or under persistent strike threat. The pontoon replacements are targets. The sea routes are contested. The industrial facilities are being struck. The occupation administration is invoking siege vocabulary in official statements. Liberation, if it comes, will not arrive as Ukrainian infantry crossing the Perekop. It will arrive as a Russian occupation that has become too expensive, too dysfunctional, and too dangerous to sustain, withdrawing from a peninsula that was once the symbol of Russian power projection in the Black Sea and has become instead the clearest evidence of how far that power has diminished. Stay with this channel. The Crimea campaign is accelerating, the operational effects are becoming measurable, and every development in the coming weeks connects directly to what we have covered here.